Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining me today. I'm looking forward to this talk, and Margaret is a very well-respected, well-regarded founder of a lot of the work in my field, so I feel very honored to have been introduced by her. My name is Alexandra Croswell, and I have my PhD in health psychology, and whenever I say that, people always say, well, you've got to study me because I want health, and I got a lot of psychological stuff going on. And I'm not a clinical psychologist, so I don't study or I don't treat patients, but instead I'm a behavioral scientist. So I'm really interested in what's going on in the mind and how that connects to your behaviors, and then at an even deeper level, how that connects to biology. I've always been interested in stress in particular, and that began when I was an undergraduate working at the Duke University Cancer Center, because my job as an undergraduate was to go and sit in the waiting rooms and introduce patients who were waiting for their cancer treatment to different clinical trials that they could enroll in as research participants. And often they would want to talk to me about their experience of having cancer. And many of them would say that they knew what had caused their cancer. And it was some stressful event that had happened in their life, like they got divorced or they were having problems with one of their children. And that really put in my brain the research question that I've pursued for the past 10 years, which is it really possible that some sort of stressful event, so something emotional that happens to you in your life, could impact you all the way down to the cellular level? And what we found out is that, yes, indeed it can. There have now been decades of research showing that experiencing a greater number of stressful life events or greater levels of perceptions of stress in your life is associated with a greater risk for disease and mortality. And even beyond that, we know how that's possible. We know a lot of the biological mechanisms. So it's through chronic inflammation, through sleep disorders, through clinical disorders like depression, through dysregulation of your hormonal systems. Those are the ways in which stress influences disease. And so now, me and my colleagues, we've really shifted our focus to trying to understand, well, what can we do about that? If we all experience stress in our life, and we know it's going to happen to each of us, something stressful or difficult that we're going to encounter, what can we do to make sure that we're resilient, that we remain resilient, or that we continue to build resilience? And what's been really exciting in the past few years for me is that we've begun to incorporate some of the contemplative practices and traditions, such as yoga and meditation, into our research to try and glean some of the insights from traditional religions and philosophies like Buddhism and Zen philosophy and other kind of classical religious and spiritual traditions to try and understand, like, what are the ways to maintain resilience as we age and as we deal with stressors throughout our lifespan. So today, I'm going to talk to you about some of those findings from the literature about how to remain and build resilience. And first, I'm going to teach you a little bit about the physiology of stress. So the American Psychological Association puts out a report every year on the state of stress in the United States. And so a lot of the stressors are things that we would likely guess are stressful for people. Work, money, housing costs, the economy, health problems affecting family. These are relevant for many of us. One of the findings from the 2017 APA report on stress that I found particularly interesting was that 1 in 10 Americans report that physical and personal safety is a primary stressor in their life, meaning that they feel unsafe in their workplace, in their home, in their neighborhood to such a degree that it's a major daily stressor for them. So if we think about that, that means that 10% of Americans are walking around every day in a state of fear and threat. And from a physiological standpoint, that is extremely toxic for your health. Because when you are in a state of fear and threat, your brain is activated. The areas of your brain that are activated launch a physiological response of heightened arousal and heightened activation. And that over time leads to cardiovascular disease, diseases related to chronic inflammation. I mean, it really burns out the system. And so I think it's important as we're talking about, or thinking about the stressors in our life, that we think about the global implications, and especially the implications for our country, of people being in these constant states of stress and threat. The APA report looked at stress by gender, and we see that women report significantly higher levels of perceived stress than men. And this could be for many reasons, such as women take on the brunt of the caregiving activities within their family, which is something that I've studied extensively, and is caregiving, whether it's for a spouse, an elderly parent, or a child who has special needs. It can be extremely stressful. The report also presents data on how stress varies by generation. And what you're seeing here is that the millennials, which are aged 18 to 36, are the most stressed, and the least stressed are the matures, which is 70 or older. And if you think about this from a life, this is not just because of millennials, but it's because of development over the life course. So what happens when you're 18 to 36? Well, you're dealing with your first job, you have children, you're at the early stages of your career. Across the lifespan, this is the time where you're going through a significant number of changes. And you have yet to develop all the coping skills needed to effectively handle stress. And as you age, you learn those coping skills and are better able to handle stress. We know that as we age, emotional function is one thing that's really preserved. So although memory declines are common and declines in physical functioning are common, emotional functioning actually improves as you age. So for example, older adults are better at seeing the positive aspects of situations and focusing on those positive aspects instead of focusing on the negatives. So that's a skill that we develop as we age and go through different life stressors and experiences. When I talk about stress, there's many different kinds of stress. The kind of stress that I'm most interested in is chronic stress. And here you see an image of a caregiver, a woman caring for her elderly father. And that is a chronic stressor because it's this everyday intensity of a relationship and of a responsibility that can really wear on people and be very difficult. Acute stress is another type of stressor, and what you see here is a couple getting into an argument. So an acute stressor is a time-limited event where you have an arousal of your physiological response system that we're very familiar with. So when you get into an argument, it's kind of like when you're sitting in traffic, it's the similar arousal of frustration and angst. You can kind of feel it in your body, and then when that event is over, you feel the decline as well, and you're back to your normal state. So that's an acute stressor. We also examine life events. So what I'm showing you here is a chart of someone's life. Here's when they're 18, and then as you were getting older, you go along this x-axis, and what you can see is that there are different events in this person's life that were stressful life events. The brother was in a car accident, accused of plagiarism, divorce, cancer diagnosis. And what we often do is ask people, we conduct an interview where we add up all of the different life events or stressful life events that have happened to you. And there's some indication that kind of an accumulation of the greater number of stressful life events is worse for your health or is predictive of disease. And there's several different reasons we think that. I won't go into them now, but that's a very interesting topic. Like, how could it be that something that happened to you when you were 20 influences your risk of cardiovascular disease when you're 60? I mean, we have kind of worked out some of the different reasons or pathways for that to happen. One thing that's standing out right now in the literature is that stress in childhood, so before age 18, experiencing a greater number of stressful life events is associated with a much greater disease risk in adulthood. And so again, it's that question about what is it that's happening, probably something developmentally that is getting disrupted by a stressful life event in childhood that then has ramifications for the rest of your life. One thing that ties all of these different stressful events together is that this umbrella term of stress activates two primary physiological systems. So as I talked about before, when you feel like you're under stress, like you're getting in a fight with somebody, you feel that arousal, like your heart begins to race and your palms get a little bit sweaty, and you feel that arousal. That's because of the sympathetic nervous system. So you don't have to look too closely at this kind of complex chart, but what this is showing you is that the brain innervates, so it has nerves going right from the brain directly into all these organs, to your eyes, to your salivary glands, to your heart, and to your lungs. And so when you're under a stressful event, like getting in a fight with somebody, your system activates all of those different organs. So you start breathing faster, your heart speeds up, you start salivating a little bit more. And the reason for that is very evolutionary. It's that when you were way back many generations ago, when there was real threats in the environment, like a bear, you saw a bear in the wilderness, your stress response was developed so that you could run away from that bear. And so it is pumping, that stress response is pumping the blood and getting the oxygen into your body so that you can actually deal with that threat in the environment. Now, of course, we don't have bears anymore trying to chase us, but that system has remained. So that's the role of the sympathetic nervous system. Then you have the parasympathetic nervous system, which acts in counterbalance to the sympathetic response. And the parasympathetic nervous system also innervates via one nerve, the vagus nerve, all of these different organs. But its job is to actually do the opposite. So if the sympathetic nervous system arouses all these different organs and gets them activated, the parasympathetic nervous system comes online a little bit after that initial response to shut it down, to say, it's all right, you're safe, there's no bear, it's okay. And so you want a really nice balance between the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. So that yoga, for those of you who were here doing the yoga during the break, that was activating this parasympathetic nervous system, because it was through the deep breath work and the gentle movements, you're giving your body the signal that we're okay, we're safe. And this is essential to health and well-being, because it is through this system in which healing and regeneration of cells and tissue, your muscles, regeneration of every living part of your body happens. So back to that example I gave earlier of the people who are under that threat of safety of their life, whether it's because they live in a really unsafe neighborhood or they're in an abusive relationship at work or at home. This system is always activated. This is never on. So there's no time for that rest and healing to take place. So for the cores of the stress response are really to mobilize energy to help your muscles work, to transport energy throughout the body wherever it's needed to deal with whatever the environment is demanding of you, and to turn off any long-term projects. So, for example, you don't do a lot of digesting under states of stress, which may be one of the reasons that stress leads to obesity. You also don't put a lot of energy into reproductive organs and reproductive health, because in that moment, reproduction is irrelevant, because the focus of your physiological systems is just to ensure your survival in that moment. So the stress response is not bad. It's really adaptive, and it's something that we all need in order to be able to handle the demands of the environment. Me giving a speech up here, my stress response is activated. So it's not that I wouldn't want this stress response, because it's helping me focus and it's helping me say what I want to say and not just be loosey-goosey and relaxed. But the stress response, if the stress response is activated for too long or too frequently throughout the day or throughout your life, or the physiological reaction that it's inducing is not really helpful for whatever goal you're trying to achieve, that's why we think that stress leads to disease, is because of when we have the stress response in all of these different ways. And this is called allostatic load. So allostatic load is the wear and tear resulting from chronic overactivity of the stress response. And what these graphs are showing you are all of the different maladaptive patterns that can happen to your stress response system. And basically the idea is that overreactivity or too many stressors or too frequently or no parasympathetic nervous system activity, and so this heightened arousal and vigilance just wears out your system over time. And that's why stress is associated with progression of cancer, cardiovascular disease risk, and mortality. There's some really exciting new work that has identified what actually do we mean when we say allostatic load, when we're talking about this wear and tear on the body. Well, what we think is happening is this degradation of something called telomeres. And telomeres are the caps on the end of our chromosomes. Just to bring you back to middle school biology, a chromosome is where all of your DNA is stored. And your DNA is the information that is needed to generate any sort of protein, hormone, molecule, regenerate your cell in your body. And what a telomere is, it's kind of like the cap on the end of your shoelace. So it's that protective ending to something that once it's degraded, the shoelace frays. And so once a telomere, this cap, is degraded on your chromosome, the information in your DNA can start to fray. And research is now suggesting that this is one of the fundamental elements of human aging, is this degradation of telomeres. The good news is that telomerase is an enzyme that all of us have that can rebuild those telomeres. In this book that just came out last year by Elizabeth Blackburn and Alyssa Epple, who are both at UCSF, and Alyssa is my research mentor, they talk about the effect of telomeres on health and aging and what you can actually do. And some of the most groundbreaking research coming from Alyssa is showing that you can actually grow back your telomeres. So there's evidence that meditation, exercise, taking care of your body can not just slow the decline, but potentially even increase telomerase, which then helps the telomeres rebuild. One of the biggest types of chronic stress that is coming out of the research, and many of you may have seen it in the news media, is this idea that loneliness is really toxic for our health. We think of loneliness as a chronic stressor because it's the deprivation of a basic human need, which is meaningful social connection. And so the research has been showing that loneliness, so that means feeling disconnected, feeling like you don't have anybody to go to in times of need or for meaningful social connection, has been linked to an increased risk of cardiovascular disease, stroke, the progression of Alzheimer's disease, and mortality. And a recent meta-analysis, which is a data technique in which you combine data from many different studies. This study was so large, this meta-analysis was so large that it combined data from 3 million people, found a 26 to 32% increase in risk of mortality for those who were living alone or reporting the highest levels of loneliness. And that was equivalent to the same as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So that's why you saw all this big news about it. 15 cigarettes a day, that's a lot of cigarettes. And we know how terrible cigarettes are for your health. And so this is kind of identifying and quantifying this new risk factor for health and disease. And there's even some studies that have suggested that being lonely or living alone is a greater risk factor for disease than obesity. This is a really exciting image, maybe to only the scientists in the room, but I'll walk you through why this is really an interesting image to look at. So you're seeing all different pictures of the brain. This was another meta-analysis, again, where they combined data from over 1,000 studies. And what I want you to take from this is all the yellow parts. And here's why. The red is what parts of the brain are activated during emotional experiences. So people go into these research studies and they sit in the fMRI and have their brain imaged, and during that brain imaging, they do different tasks. And so you'll see, for example, pictures of happy people or pictures of sad people. And during that time, you feel sad or happy because of whatever you're seeing in the scanner. And so what they're identifying in those studies and in this red are the parts of the brain that are lit up during emotions. The green, they do the same thing where they put you in the scanner, but instead they do some sort of task that has to do with a social interaction. So maybe you are reading a letter from your spouse, or maybe you're holding the hand outside the scanner of a friend. And the green are the parts of the brain that are lit up during those social encounters. And the yellow is the overlap between the social and the emotional experiences. And what you can see is that most of that is yellow. So our emotional life is just biologically integrated and tied to our social life. And our social life is biologically integrated with our emotional life. And if you think of all the stressors that you've experienced in your life, most of them have to do with other people. And often our social encounters induce some sort of emotional experience. So social connection, it makes sense that loneliness is so detrimental to our health because social connection is just an integral part of our health and well-being as humans. There's this recent theory called the social baseline theory that has suggested that instead of thinking of humans as individual functioning people, we actually need to think of our baseline as social creatures. So when you remove something like meaningful social connection, that's when the system is dysregulated. A meaningful social connection, like a good relationship with your spouse, is not an addition to your life, it's an integral part of your life. Sense of belonging is one core component of social connection. So it doesn't mean that you have to be married and in this perfect marriage, but social belonging suggests that one way to find social connection is to find a community in which you identify. So feel that sense of belonging, which fulfills a basic human need. Good social relationships can also really protect you from stress, and that there's a lot of evidence suggesting that when you're going through a stressful event, if you reach out to friends and family, if you talk through the stressful experience, that helps you adjust better and reduce your physiological arousal. One tool to enhance your social connection is being present with others. What I mean by presence is being engaged in the present moment, what some people call mindfulness. John Kabat-Zinn, who was instrumental in bringing this concept of mindfulness and mindfulness training into the Western world and specifically into medical centers, says that mindfulness is paying attention in a particular way, on purpose, in the present moment, and non-judgmentally. Most of our minds operate as what we call the monkey mind, which means it's bouncing around from one thought to the next. And we actually spend most of our day either thinking about the past or thinking about the future. And even today, as I'm talking, you're probably doing a lot of work and regulation to constantly bring your mind back to listen to what I'm saying and take it away from wherever your mind was wandering to. And that's normal. That's part of the human mind. And so what mindfulness is suggesting is that the more we can actually stay present, the higher level of well-being, happiness, joy we can experience, because we're really engrossed in the moment. And that our minds generally don't want to be that and don't want to be there. And that we need practice to get us there. So mindfulness trainings have really taken off and taken on a life of their own in order to help people learn how to train that attention and bring your attention to the present moment. Mindfulness trainings can be delivered in traditional classroom settings. You can go on intensive day-long, 3-day, month-long retreats. And now you can even access them via mobile apps for daily practice. Headspace is a very common one, which delivers mindfulness training over your iPhone or any sort of smartphone in 10 minutes a day. And the core components of any sort of mindfulness training is really a focus on the breath, accepting momentary experiences as they are, and then letting them go. So one of the metaphors that I really like from mindfulness training is that imagine that you're sitting on a riverbank and the river is your thoughts and emotions. And you're watching your thoughts and emotions float by and you're noticing them and then you're moving on to the next part of the river. So instead of getting carried down the river, you're separating yourself and sitting up on the riverbank. And in my studies of mindfulness training, which I've conducted in a variety of different populations, we've found improvements in psychological and physical health. So we conducted a study in younger breast cancer survivors. So these are women who were diagnosed with breast cancer before age 50, and they are at an increased risk for breast cancer throughout the rest of their life. And it comes out of sync with an expectation of illness, and so it can be very distressing and difficult for them in particular. And we found that women who participated in our mindfulness training showed improvements in psychological well-being and also decreased pro-inflammatory gene expression, which means decreases in levels of chronic inflammation, which is essential for maintaining health and lowering your risk of breast cancer in the future. In a recent study I just conducted here at UCSF, we found that caregivers, older adult caregivers of Alzheimer's or neurodegenerative disease patients who participated in a meditation study where they were focusing on their breath 30 minutes a day for several weeks, showed a decrease in anxiety, depression, perceived stress, and an improvement in attentional abilities. So potentially a maintenance of their cognitive functioning. I also just published a study in high-stress employees that showed that participating in that Headspace app for 10 minutes a day for several weeks decreased job strain, which is how stressed you are from your job, and also decreased ambulatory blood pressure, which means that throughout the day, their blood pressure was lower in their work environment. One reason that we think mindfulness is so helpful is because it helps you surf the waves of difficult emotions experienced during stress. So again, you're able to experience and observe the difficult thought and emotions without getting kind of caught in the story. You recognize that feelings are fleeting and that they don't define you. And it can help you decrease rumination about difficult events. And rumination has really come out as one of the most potent reasons that stress stays with you for so long. And rumination is defined as the unhelpful, repetitive thoughts about something difficult. So if you are constantly repeating the same conversation, why did you say that in that fight? Or why did you have to instigate him in that way? And you keep replaying that and it doesn't get resolved. That's one of the ways that you maintain that physiological stress arousal and that sympathetic nervous system, and don't let your body go into the parasympathetic nervous system response, which you need for healing and calm and to recover from stress. Viktor Frankl has a quote that I think these ideas really echo, which is that between a stimulus and response, there is a space. And in that space is our power to choose our response. And in our response lies our growth and our freedom. So I think of mindfulness as one of the practices in which you can start to separate yourself from that initial response. And I wanted to test that in a research setting. And so what we did in that study I told you about with the breast cancer survivors, after they participated in the mindfulness training, we invited them into our research lab to do an acute stress test. And what that means is that in this study, they told us about something that was really anxiety-provoking for them. And they talked to me about this for 5 minutes. And they told me something like, I found another lump in my breast, and I thought for sure it was breast cancer. And so when they're reliving that anxiety-provoking experience, they really feel it. Their heart rate increases. I can see them get anxious and as they're telling me about it. And when they're doing that for 5 minutes, here's what happens. Their blood pressure, here's them at baseline sitting in this chair. Then they start telling me about their anxiety-provoking experience, and their blood pressure goes up, as we would expect. Then they stop telling me about it, and they're allowed to sit and recover. So they recover, and their blood pressure goes down and stays down as they're sitting in their chair for 12 minutes. And what we found is that women in the intervention groups, that means they had received the mindfulness training, which was an 8-week training program, were able to recover faster, in the red line, than the women who didn't receive the training and were on the waitlist control. So they did nothing for those weeks. And so what this is showing is that It's not that the women in the mindfulness group didn't get worked up. It didn't erase that arousal from the experience. Instead, it helped them to recover. They had a new tool in which they were able to bring down their physiological arousal. And we saw that with systolic blood pressure as well, where we see just a more efficient response. And so I think that this is really important because it suggests that one of the benefits of practicing mindfulness meditation is that you can improve your emotion regulation. And emotion regulation is a key skill for all of us to effectively navigate the complexities of life. And that mindfulness training may also help us recover more effectively and efficiently from negative emotions in particular, like feeling anxious. So it might be a particularly good tool for people who struggle with anxiety. One thing that mindfulness meditation also does is improve our interactions with others. So it helps enhance our altruistic feelings and motivations towards others. So it makes us want to help others more and engage with people in a more meaningful way, which might enhance our connection to others. And so what we wanted to understand was, what is really happening in order to achieve all these great things of mindfulness? What's really happening at the daily level? Like, what is going on in your day-to-day life that might help us understand how mindfulness training improves all these great outcomes and things? And so we started focusing on attentional awareness, meaning what is going on with what you're paying attention to at the daily level in your daily life if you're more mindful. And so our research question was, how are our experiences of stress and daily mindfulness states intertwined? And just when we first wanted to look at this and understand the association, we ran this correlation to look at mind wandering and perceptions of stress. And what you're seeing here is that people who are under greater levels of stress, so here's stress on your y-axis, so higher levels of stress is associated with, on your x-axis, mind wandering. So there's a positive correlation between mind wandering and perceived stress. And so we think of mind wandering as you're really not being in the present moment. It's the opposite of presence. Your mind is in many different places at once. And again, this is what research has shown where we spend most of our time, either in the past or future, or random thoughts, or, oh, isn't it kind of cool in here? Where's my jacket? Just these random thoughts, stream of consciousness that goes through our brains. And that is associated with greater levels of stress. What we wanted to zero in on is like, what is happening in these moments of your life? And so we asked people for over 21 days, every day, to report on to answer several different questions. And one of those questions was, how much in the past 30 minutes did you feel totally focused or engaged in the moment? And then how much did you feel like you didn't want to be where you were or doing what you were doing, which we call rejection of the moment. And we've become very interested in this idea because we think it's one of the fundamental aspects of being under chronic stress, which is that you just don't want to be where you are. And that's actually a fundamental Buddhist tenet, is that suffering comes from non-acceptance of the present moment reality, or rejection of that moment. And so think about how kind of toxic that might be for you if you're constantly in a situation where you just feel like you don't want to be there. And oh, isn't this just so terrible? That we think that that's really going to activate that sympathetic nervous system and put you in this state of threat and fear all day, every day. So what we found is that in these women, where we recruited a group of very high stress women and a group of low stress midlife women, over 21 days we found that women under chronic stress reported greater rejection of the moment and less presence, as we had expected. And interestingly, that rejecting the moment was associated with worse mood. So they reported just being more depressed, being more anxious, while presence was associated with better mood, more happiness, more joy. And that more presence and less rejection of the moment was associated with a better quality of connection with your spouse and your child that day. So again, we have this integration between the emotional life and the social life. And presence may have real biological implications. So what we found, and this is just some new analyses that are coming out, we haven't published these yet, we were finding that rejection of the moment, people who rejected the moment more, was actually associated with lower levels of telomerase. Telomerase is that essential enzyme that helps you rebuild your telomeres. So there might be something really potent about where your mind is each day, like what you're spending your mind focused on and attentive to. And that mind states, where your mind is, influences your mental health, your social relationships, and potentially your cellular health and ultimately your longevity. So engaging with the present moment puts you in a better mood and helps you connect with those close to you. There may be biological ramifications for what you spend your time thinking about. And the question really then is, what helps you engage with the moment? What helps put you in a state of flow? And a state of flow is where you're totally engaged in your present moment experience. And this is often experienced by artists, for example, who are in their art studio, or athletes who are on the tennis court, where nothing else around them is entering into their mind because they're totally in a state of flow. So what gets you there? Mindfulness training might be one tool. It's an evidence-based tool, and it's accessible via different apps and training programs, and it can become a great daily practice. But are there other evidence-based tools to enhance resilience? Because mindfulness is not for everybody, and meditation is difficult. So people say, well, I'm just not good at meditation. Well, no one is good at meditation. It takes a lot of practice and training, and that's the work. It's the hard work to get good, but not everyone's interested in that. And what's really exciting, over the past 10 years, there have been a lot of practices that can help us build resilience beyond just helping us be more mindful. And I'm going to go through some of those now. I want to direct all of you to this great resource that's based at UC Berkeley called the Greater Good Science Center. And the Greater Good Science Center has compiled all of the research and all of these great different practices that you can try out and both read about and try. And so if you see on their keys to well-being right here, mindfulness is one of the many keys to well-being. There's also awe, compassion, empathy, forgiveness, gratitude, happiness, social connection, and more. And what's really great about this website is that it offers you practices. So if you were trying to build something like compassion, connection, forgiveness, they actually offer very short, brief, 5 to 15 minute evidence-based exercises to try, to start to experiment and see what daily practices, or even just a one-off practice might work for you to boost your stress resilience and boost your mood and happiness. I'm going to talk to you about 3 different exercises and practices that I'm really excited about. One is gratitude, second is meaning making, and the third is our challenge versus threat. And I'm going to go through these pretty quickly just to give you kind of a taste or a flavor for these different exercises so that you can try them on your own. Gratitude journaling is probably one of the most well-studied positive psychology or mind-body psychological interventions out there. Gratitude journaling means that you are identifying several things that you're grateful for. And you do this 1 to 3 times a week, but each time you identify something new. So you really quickly go through my family, my house, this great city, the beautiful day. And once you get through those, you have to really dig deep and start noticing the beauty around you. And you say, oh, it's the light that shines into my kitchen. Or it's that one blooming daffodil on that sidewalk. And you start to really train your brain to notice the really small, minor things that you're grateful for and that you find beautiful. Just yesterday, I was on an airplane, and I was sitting next to a man, and I pulled up this presentation because I was practicing it and running through it in my head. And he said, well, what are you working on? And he saw the title, and I told him, and he said, I've been in the military for 25 years. I'm a sergeant major in the Army, and we did a resiliency training. And I said, well, what did you learn, and what was the most impactful for you? And he said, the most impactful was something, I think they just called it 3 good things. And it was where you had to find 3 things that you were grateful for, or that you found beautiful. And it was the same idea where you couldn't repeat the same thing. And he said when he was serving in Iraq, that almost became their group's mantra. And they kind of treated it like a joke where they would say, well, what are your 3 things, But he said when the going was tough and they were in some really difficult situations, he said one of us would always chime in and say, well, what are the 3 things And it would really turn around their energy and their emotions about the experience. So that is a very powerful tool. The second is meaning making and finding benefit. So how can you, during difficult times, see the meaning and purpose in it? And there are different activities on that Greater Good website to help you do that, like through writing or through different reappraisal activities where it asks you kind of poignant questions about what might one positive thing be from this negative experience. And then the final one is a challenge versus threat appraisal. And this is a lot of work coming from one of my research mentors, Wendy Mendez. We work actually right across the street at the UCSF research offices. And she has been studying appraisal, meaning how are you appraising or perceiving a certain experience? So giving a speech is the perfect example where one way to view giving a public speech is that it's an opportunity for people to negatively evaluate you. So it's a chance for people to really see that you don't actually know what you're talking about, or to see just how nervous you get in front of people, and that would be a threat appraisal. So you can see in this image here, this guy seems very nervous, like everyone's staring at him, versus a challenge appraisal, like Steve Jobs, who was able to say, who was able to come into a speech and connect with the audience because he was able to view this as an incredible opportunity to share his vision of his company, of the future, of a product, of the future of the world. And so that would be a challenge appraisal where he's really viewing it like this great challenge for him to try his best to connect his meaningful message. And physiologically, there's actually different functioning of the physiological systems that are going on in both the challenge and a threat appraisal. So I'd like to end by saying, please, get involved in research. We would love to have you engaged in all these wonderful things that we're learning. You can join the Brain Health Registry. This is open to everyone and anyone. And you can read more about our in-person research studies and this Living Younger and Fuller platform that we're developing by Googling Aging, Metabolism, and Emotions Lab. And thank you.